Broncos country, it is officially game week as the NFL season launches this week. The Broncos will take on the Seattle Seahawks next Monday on Monday Night Football. But what does the Broncos offense need to do this week in preparation leading up to next Monday's matchup? What about the defensive side of the ball? Plus, we also take a look at what we want to see from the Broncos this week. You get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by our good friends over there at PrizePicks. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos beat reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre, Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, whether you watch us on YouTube. We appreciate you so much. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button if you have not done so already, so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage. Sayre, my friend, the NFL regular season is officially here. We have action on Thursday with the Bills and Rams. I'm excited about just football kicking off in general, but you know what? We're just about a week away exactly from the Denver Broncos traveling to Seattle to take on the Seattle Seahawks.
It's about time, right? I mean, man, the last 8 or so months has really felt like almost like 8 years. And really, the Broncos have accomplished a lot more in the last 8 months than they have maybe in the last, well, not 8 years. They won a Super Bowl within the last 8 years. Let's not get carried away. But you got a new owner. You got a new coach. You got a new quarterback. You got new. The new quarterback has a new contract. Everything is new in Denver. It's time for the new era to start, Cody. I think everybody in Broncos country is ready. The excitement is brimming, overflowing. Let's ride, man. We're ready to go.
Well, what can Broncos fans expect this week here on the Lockdown Broncos podcast? Well, we are in season, so you know what that means. It's the return of Crossover Thursday. On Thursday's episode, we'll obviously have a sit down. We'll preview the game with Corbin Smith of the Locked On Seahawks podcast. But in the meantime, we are building things up here, and we're going to dive into some of the storylines that kind of get us ready for game week here in a sense. So, Sayre, let's stay on the Broncos offensive side of the ball right now in terms of looking at maybe what the Broncos offense needs to do this week in terms of preparation. And so when you prepare for the Seattle Seahawks defense, now granted, they were one of the worst defensive units in the NFL last season. They lose Bobby Wagner. That's a big blow for them defensively. But I would also say they also dealt with a variety of injuries to some key players, Jamal Adams being one of those guys. But Denver has to prepare for these guys, and there's going to be some talented players on the Seahawks defense that could disrupt the Broncos' offensive rhythm this upcoming Monday. So for me, I'm going to start things off on the Seattle Seahawks back end here, and I really think that their safety duo features a combination of finesse and also power, and we got to focus on Quandre Diggs here, who's one of the best safeties in the National Football League, in my opinion, Sayre. He is a playmaker for them, and rightfully so. They took care of him after he suffered that gruesome leg injury. He's a big part of their defense on the back end, but so is safety Jamal Adams, who they made that blockbuster trade for just several years ago. He's had a hard time staying healthy, and if I'm not mistaken, he did something where he's going to have to play with his hand in a cast this upcoming season. Regardless, these are two very talented players. They do have some familiarity with Russell Wilson, so I'm going to be very excited to see how the Broncos maybe try to attack this secondary a little bit here for the Seattle Seahawks defense.
Absolutely. And like you said, starting with those two guys, right? Those are the key players that you're looking for, because gone are the days of the Legion of Boom. I'm pretty sure that entire defense is pretty much dismantled at this point. So really not a lot of familiar faces as far as Denver Broncos fans are concerned. Unless you really follow the Seahawks closely, it's going to be a different team out there. So, and moving towards that front seven, Cody, you mentioned guys on the backside, and we'll see Jamal Adams probably play in the box quite a bit. He's going to be playing alongside a guy named Jordan Brooks, who is one of the up-and-coming linebackers in the NFL, former first-round pick out of Texas Tech. The Seahawks have really high hopes for him. And rightly so. I mean, they drafted him with a first-round selection, and he's an athlete. He's a big-time athlete out there, and that's what the Seahawks defense is kind of loaded with. Typically, you see this the way that they build their team out there in Seattle. They like the big-time athletes, just like we've seen the Broncos emphasize that the relative athletic score, the RAS guys coming out of the NFL draft. the Seattle Seahawks have been doing that for a long time with guys that have huge RAS scores, big time size, all that different type of stuff. And they like to play fast. Jordan Brooks can play fast, and he's going to be playing behind a familiar face there. The newest, I would say, Cody, the newest and best Seattle Seahawks defensive lineman.
Well, and that's going to be former Denver Broncos Shelby Harris. Now, this is going to be an interesting matchup. I think we were all looking for the storyline of Russell Wilson taking on his former team, Drew Lock taking on his former team, but it won't be Drew Lock that's going to get the start. It'll be Geno Smith. So much for that fun narrative that we were hoping to have here on this episode, Locked On Broncos. But former friend Shelby Harris will be in the mix on the defensive line alongside outside linebacker Uchenna Nwosu, who the Broncos have some familiarity with. He played for the Los Angeles Chargers, I believe, last season. But then there's another guy. He's not number one on the depth chart there, but he's in a rotation, and that is someone that you and I were talking about in the NFL draft process, and that is Boye Mafe, an edge rusher off the edge. And for him, he has speed. He has the ability to get inside quickly. He's got some finesse to him, and I thought he also had a pretty impressive preseason for the Seahawks defense alongside Poona Ford, who's going to man up some size there on that defensive line. I mean, there aren't any slouches, in my opinion, on the Seahawks defense. When we talk about defensive line to linebacker to the secondary, there's good players all across the board for this Seattle Seahawks defense here.
There really is. And Boye Mafe is that guy, Cody. When I talk about high RAS score, big time athlete, all the different things that you can't teach, like speed, length, power. I mean, all those different things, he's got it in spades. And we did see that on full display in the preseason. And actually, Boye Mafe, I believe, Cody, he was acquired with one of the picks that the Broncos sent over to Seattle in that Russell Wilson trade. If memory serves me right, he was their top pick in round 2, right ahead of Kenneth Walker. Somebody in the comments can correct me if I'm wrong on that one, but there's added intrigue all over the place in terms of just this Seattle Seahawks defense going up against Russell Wilson. It's not the 2013 Seahawks, but there's a lot of guys out there that they're building around, guys that they have huge hopes for. And Boye Mafe is one of those players, Cody, that he can go out there and he can kind of wreck games. I mean, he's got the length, he's got the speed off the edge. You know, Garrett Bowles is going to have to be on top of his game, and Boye Mafe gets out there. He's going to be coming in with fresh legs, and he's going to be coming out there hungry to get a hit on Russell Wilson. You know that these rookie pass rushers coming into the NFL, they want to get the best of the best. They want to sack the best quarterbacks. You ask 9 out of 10 guys are going to say Tom Brady, the guy they want to sack the most. I'm sure Russell Wilson is not far behind on that list, especially in a game like this.
Well, the atmosphere is anticipated to be very electric with Russell Wilson coming home. And, you know, based on the comments we've seen on social media, I imagine he's probably going to get booed by Seahawks fans, which is one of the, you know, the oddest behavior in the world. But you know what it is, I know we're very excited to be able to cover Russell Wilson every single day here in the Lockdown Broncos podcast. But Broncos country coming up here in just a moment. Sayre and I, we're going to discuss which players on the Seahawks offense do the Broncos need to take extra seriously in their game prep this week. We give a little bit of a scouting report and much more coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about PrizePicks, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. And for week 1 of the NFL season, I'm taking Russell Wilson to throw for more than 340 passing yards. I'm going to take Derrick Henry to rush for less than 95 yards. And I want to take Courtland Sutton to catch more than 1 touchdown this upcoming week. And Tyreek Hill, I'm going to anticipate he'll catch less than 5 passes this week on PrizePicks. So how does it work? You get to pick 2 to 5 players, and if they will go score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections that are available. And entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that easy. Plus, they're currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match of up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. So if you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will also give you $50. So don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Who are some players that the Broncos defense needs to account for in their game preparation this week against the Seattle Seahawks? Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in and making Lockdown Broncos your first listen or watch of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, whether you watch us on YouTube. We appreciate you so much. You can also watch us on the 9 News app on your Roku TV and more. So go to 9news.com to check out a little bit more information on that as well. OTT, baby. But anyway, Sayre, let's take a look at the Seattle Seahawks offense. Now, granted, they lose Russell Wilson, who is a perennial part of what their offense was, and he's been a big portion of that all throughout his entire career. Now they enter very unfamiliar territory in a world without Russell Wilson by the name of Geno Smith. And Geno Smith has kind of been this guy that's kind of gone through the ups and downs of being in the NFL. And he won the job in the preseason, beating out Drew Lock, who just simply couldn't be more consistent on the offensive side of the ball. Plus, turnovers were a huge issue for Drew in the preseason. There's obviously that, but I think everyone in Broncos country is pretty much focused on the wide receiver position for the Seattle Seahawks team. Now, granted, even though that Geno Smith is not a guy like Russell Wilson, all he's got to do is throw it up and give DK Metcalf a chance. Tyler Lockett, the same exact kind of situation there. It's a little different here. But I think when we look at those two wide receivers, those are the biggest threats to the Denver Broncos. However, Sayre, there are some other wide receivers on that list that could pose a threat to Denver as well.
There certainly could. I mean, Marquise Goodwin, he's a veteran with big-time speed. Dwayne Eskridge, for those NFL draft fans that really liked him coming out a couple years ago, I mean, what are the Seahawks going to get from him? He's kind of a wild card at this point. We don't necessarily know what or if anything he's going to bring to the table. We don't know necessarily, I guess, really any of the back-end guys on this roster, players that they're counting on making a big impact. I know the Seahawks, they have a lot of guys out there at receiver, but I expect them, Cody, to really heavily rely on their big money receivers. That's DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett. They also invested quite a bit in the tight end position this offseason. Of course, coming back in that Russell Wilson trade, you got Noah Fant, another familiar face coming from Denver to Seattle. And Noah Fant, I think people don't really realize this, Cody, because quickly we block these things out of our memory. Again, a lot has happened in the last 8 months, but it's also easy to quickly block things out of our memory. Like last season, Noah Fant led the Denver Broncos in receptions in 2021. So he's no slouch out there for the Seattle Seahawks. He's kind of a quarterback's best friend in a lot of ways in the passing game. And Will Dissly signed a 3-year contract worth $24 million. Will Dissly, I guess, you know, the rumor mill as it was churning, there were rumors that the Broncos were interested in potentially signing him at one point as well. So there's a lot of different things going on here. But in the passing game for the Seattle Seahawks, I think we can expect, I mean, as long as Geno can get the ball into the right spot, the Broncos are going to have to play tight coverage because these are some really good receivers and tight ends out there catching the passes.
Well, and I think the bigger question is who's going to match up with DK Metcalf, who's going to match up with Tyler Lockett. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see what maybe the Broncos defense's game plan is under Ejiro Evero this week. I mean, I think most people anticipate DK Metcalf versus Patrick Surtain, which I think is electric. That's pay-per-view, must-watch TV. In my opinion, luckily enough, we're going to get that on Monday Night Football. But then you factor in like Tyler Lockett, because he goes everywhere. He plays on the outside. He plays on the inside. He gets across the field. So I think that's where K'Wan Williams will really have to step up this week. And not only that, just the communication from the back end with the safeties, with Justin Simmons, Caden Stearns, if he gets playing time there, Kareem Jackson, PJ Locke. Those back-end guys really have to have really good communication with the secondary, with the corners. If there's an inside release, there's got to be an in call. If there's a vertical release, it's an up, 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 up. These are some things that I'm looking forward to seeing how the Broncos kind of approach this week in their game prep. But yeah, Seattle's offense, I think, will be a little bit of a test for the Broncos. And look, here's the deal. Sayre, everyone is 0-0, okay? You can look at how teams did last year. You can look at the record last year, and you can maybe make the assumption, okay, this team's going to win, this team's going to lose. I don't think you can do that here in week one. As we see around, college football in certain situations, it happens there. In the NFL, it really happens. Week one is a huge test for so many teams across the National Football League. But I also think one of the things of the game plan, Sayre, the Broncos must do, and I don't think it's non-negotiable, you have to attack these offensive tackles. Now, you have Charles Cross, who's going to be getting the start for them at the offensive tackle position on the left side. And then you have a second-year player in Jake Curhan, who's also going to be starting on the right side. For me, I expect to see a very aggressive approach here from Ejiro Evero, utilizing guys like Randy Gregory, like Bradley Chubb, Draymond Jones, DJ Jones. How can you be aggressive and send pressure after Geno Smith so it throws timing off with him and guys like Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, and some of the other guys that we mentioned? To me, I think that's going to be a very big key. But what about the run game? Chris Carson's retired, so Sayre, what does the running back room look like right now here for this Seattle Seahawks team, especially as they have a rookie who's also dealing with an injury?
That's right. We mentioned Kenneth Walker. I mean, he was outstanding last year for Michigan State. He'll play a big role at some point. But like you said, we don't know exactly what his situation for week one is going to be like. And Rashad Penny coming back, another former first-round pick for the Seattle Seahawks team, and a guy that really came on at the end of last year, Cody. He was kind of a fantasy football, fanatic's dream towards the end of the season. He kind of just exploded, maybe helped people win their leagues in some cases, averaged, I believe, over 6 yards a carry down the stretch last year. And really an important breakout for him, because otherwise, who knows if he would have been back in Seattle. That was kind of maybe his last chance with them last season. So he's a guy that can break off big runs. But again, all of this hinges on Geno Smith being able to help there still be balance in that offense. Remember, the Denver Broncos last year with Teddy Bridgewater and Drew Lock as the quarterbacks, what did teams often do against those two guys? You load up the box, you force the quarterback to really beat you, bring that pressure like you talked about, and really just focus in on stopping that run first and foremost. And that's where we hope that Jonas Griffith is going to be healthy. That's where we hope that Josie Jewell, we're going to see him out there fully healthy. It's going to be critical for those guys to go out there and make plays. Draymond Jones, DJ Jones, like you mentioned, Mike Purcell. We haven't seen anything from him in the preseason as well. These guys coming out are going to have a huge task ahead of them, because if they can keep the Seahawks relatively one-dimensional and stop the run first, you put the ball in Geno Smith's hands, Cody, to me, that's a recipe for victory in this game, because that's where the Broncos can pin their ears back and send that pass rush in wave after wave.
Well, Broncos country, make sure you pay attention to some of these storylines that Sayre and I have been talking about as it pertains to matchups with this Denver Broncos football team against the Seattle Seahawks. That'll get you all throughout this week here. Locked On Broncos. Plus, we'll have a crossover episode on Thursday with Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast. And obviously, we have Monday kickoff, Monday Night Football, ESPN next week. Unfortunately, Broncos country has to wait until the final game of week 1 in order to see the Broncos play. But you know what? Football this year. We're excited about it. But what do we want to see from the Broncos this week in their preparation? What are some of the internal storylines to keep an eye on? You're going to get to that coming up here in just a moment. But real quick, just let me tell you, thank you so much to everybody who tunes in every single day to listen to Locked On Broncos, or whether you watch us on YouTube to watch the Locked On Broncos podcast. Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we enjoy putting in the time, putting in the hours to talk all things Broncos with you, the avid listeners in Broncos country. And if you're a Colorado sports fan, we also have other Locked On podcasts for you as well, including the Locked On Nuggets podcast hosted by Adam Mares and Matt Moore, the Locked On Rockies podcast hosted by Paul Holden, and the Locked On Avalanche podcast hosted by Chris Maselli and Kyle Sullivan. If you're a Colorado sports fan, right now is a very exciting time to be a Denver, Colorado sports fan. We have you covered here on the Locked On Podcast Network. What do we want to see internally from this Denver Broncos football team this week in preparation for the first game of the NFL regular season? Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. We appreciate you so much. Sayre, my friend, I think I'm going to start things off with kind of a cliche, and I think this rings true considering some of the things we've seen happen around the NFL in the last couple of years. Unfortunately, the Broncos, prior to their Week 1 matchup in 2020 against the Tennessee Titans, they lost Von Miller for the season. They lost Cortland Sutton to that AC joint initially that week, and we just saw it more recently with the Tennessee Titans. They lost Harold Landry, their pass rusher, for the entire year with a torn ACL. So I think for me, cliche as it is, I want to see a healthy build-up for the Broncos leading up to the Seattle Seahawks game. So no injuries throughout the week. You know, sometimes there's things that happen on the practice field. You land a certain way, and you can see injuries happen. But my hope and my prayer is that Denver can stay healthy this week.
They have to. I mean, it's going to be huge. That's exactly why you kept all the starters out during the preseason, right? Because you want to get to this point as healthy as you possibly can going into the start of a regular season. And we talked about this on a previous episode, but really, when is the last time that any of us can remember the Broncos being able to bring out the 11 guys on both sides of the ball that they really thought, hey, this is the guys that we're going into the season with, you know? And of course, Tim Patrick won't be there, but at the same time, I think for the majority of the guys, you know, throughout training camp, the guys that you planning on as starters, since Tim Patrick went down early, you now have obviously Jerry Jeudy out there and the majority of your offense and defense. So I agree with you completely, Cody. I think that's going to be huge. One point that I really want to emphasize here that I think this isn't necessarily something I want to see this week, but I know that the Broncos are going to have to prepare for this, and they can't take this lightly. This is the Seattle Seahawks Super Bowl, right? And I don't say that as a way to, if you're a Seahawks fan listening to this, I'm not trying to say, well, your season is a wash after this, but we can tell the Seahawks, the way that they're trying to build this thing right now, they're thinking long-term. They're not thinking 2022. You know, it's not about making the playoffs this season for them. They want to make the playoffs from now on, you know, get to that point where they can build a better roster for the future. And I think right now the Seahawks are clearly a team that's in rebuilding mode with Geno Smith at the quarterback position. definitely, Cody, this is a game that they're playing at home, and they're playing against Russell Wilson. This is their Super Bowl, so the Broncos have to be aware of that, and they have to prepare accordingly.
I think this will be a big test as well for Nathaniel Hackett. This is his first game, really, the true game that matters as the head coach of the Denver Broncos. And so how do you manage, how do you temper expectations? How do you go into this week? What is your message to your team? I know we'll find out from Nathaniel Hackett this week when the Broncos are back on the practice field there. Also, another thing, do the Broncos make any other roster moves this week? Now, over the weekend, they did bring back Asang Bassi onto the practice squad. Remember, they released him last week to make way for Darius Phillips, a veteran cornerback who spent time more recently in the last 4 years with the Cincinnati Bengals, had a brief stint with the Las Vegas Raiders, is now a number 4 cornerback on this Broncos team. So Bassi is back on the practice squad, which, if I'm not mistaken, that makes the Broncos practice squad roster 15 players out of 16. Part of me still wondering, is Brandon Johnson going to be that 16th player that we see on the Broncos practice squad? Will they come to terms with maybe an injury settlement this week? I know something that's what George Payton said last week, he and Darren Muji. We're going to try to figure out how they're going to maneuver that. So something to keep an eye on there. But, also I think, Sayre, I think another thing, too, that you touched on here is just confidence right now for this Denver Broncos team. Confidence amongst this fan base is kind of at an all-time high. And I do think that while the excitement and the confidence is good, Week 1 will be definitely an interesting test here, I think, to see maybe how this Broncos team responds. What's their mentality like for the season? And to me, I can't wait to find out.
Right. Of course, your confidence is going to be brimming. The fans' expectations are as high as they've been in a really long time. Everything has been going pretty well for the most part, right? You get a new owner, your quarterback gets a new contract. Nathaniel Hackett has brought music back to practice, and there's lots of things that are so much different in Denver this year that are just better than they were before. So I think for that, with that confidence, you can't kind of carry that around as cockiness, right? You can't go out there and just think, well, we can cut corners, we're more talented, because this isn't college football. We saw in college football what talent can do for you in games, where you got my Iowa Hawkeyes winning 7-3 over South Dakota State. It's like, man, just give South Dakota State the W there. But then you got like Georgia just crushing Oregon, Cody. I hate to bring it up, but just talent can win out in college football is the point. In the NFL, anything can happen because these guys are all professionals. These guys are all really good at what they do. And that's exactly what the Broncos have to avoid, is cutting those corners and thinking that, well, things are going so well off the field, or things are going so well in terms of just the morale around the team. We can't get so confident that we forget, hey, we got to go out there. We got to be the tougher team. We got to execute better. We got to be, we got to be winning the turnover battle. We got to be doing all these different things. They got to keep that the focus and not turn that confidence into, arrogance or cockiness.
And I think that's a huge key. I think for the starters, too, they haven't played all preseason. They're anticipating this is going to be their first on-field action. So for me, I think it's also going to be a great revealing factor. Did it benefit the Broncos from not playing their starters at all? And, me, I agree with Nathaniel Hackett. I wouldn't have played the starters either because you don't want to risk an injury to a guy that you're going to need. This is a Super Bowl-like year for the Broncos. The Broncos believe they can go to the Super Bowl. So I understand why you don't want to play your starters, your main guys in the preseason. And we obviously know Hackett has that personalized experience. He's seen firsthand why he doesn't want to do that, and he's bought into it. But I do think that for the players that didn't play, how do they look coming into their first regular season, first football action of the year against another team when it all matters? That's going to be a big storyline this week for Broncos country. Keep your dials tuned here to the Locked On Broncos podcast every single day, all week here, the Locked On Broncos podcast on your favorite audio podcasting platforms, or whether you watch us on YouTube. We have it covered also all year long, but we're going to lead you up to Monday's kickoff against the Seattle Seahawks here on the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Broncos country, tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos, Sayre and I, we're going to talk about Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams. What will the Broncos running back rotation look like this week against the Seahawks? You get that much more on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.